Hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for the eve of the golden age of science fiction. Now, when I first started my channel here about a year and a half ago or so, I thought it would be fun to do videos about the history of science fiction, which is my favorite genre to read of all, just for fun. And I thought it would be a good idea for some reason to start with the golden age of science fiction, just as a launching point. But I quickly ran into problems with that. One is because it's really kind of a gray area. I do tend to go by the July 1939 issue of Astounding Science Fiction to draw that line in the sand, just to have a before and after point of reference. I tell more of the story why it's often accepted as the beginning of the golden age in an early video that I did about A.E. Van Vogt's debut story, The Black Destroyer. But I'll leave a link to that down below if you're interested in why that issue is considered such. But as I like to say, that's another story. And just to say that drawing that line in the sand quickly became a little bit of a problem because there are significant authors that straddle that line before and after by months or years. So Isaac Asimov was one that I decided an early video to cover his few stories that happened just before the Golden Age and then into the Golden Age. And another author that is very significant to the annals of science fiction is Alfred Bester. And that's who I want to talk about today, starting with his debut story, The Broken Axiom, which appeared in the April 1939 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories, and which that's why I'm saying the eve of the golden age of science fiction, just a few months before the July 39 line in the sand. And then Bester's second story, very short story, No Help Wanted, which appeared in the December 1939 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories. So I guess before we get into that, it's probably helpful to take a look at who is Alfred Bester, probably best known for his 1952 novel, The Demolished Man, which happened to be the very first Hugo Award winner of all time, and then The Star's My Destination, his 1956 novel, both of which I think are probably what he's best known for. But to get kind of a running start here with Alfred Bester, where did he come from and where did his first story come from? Let's take a look at Mr. Bester, and then we'll go on from there. Alfred Bester was born in 1913 in New York City, and then he went on to attend the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he was a man of many interests, and in fact, he got degrees in several subjects, including music, physiology, art, and psychology. I don't know why he didn't get a degree in literature of any kind, because he was a huge fan of that, and he actually was a member of the Philomathian Society, which was a collegiate literary society at the University of Pennsylvania, and is to this day is still a claimant to being the oldest literary society in America. He was a huge fan of James Joyce and loved discussing that and other classic authors and contemporary authors of his time as a member of that society. And by 1939, he was working at a publicity office, which probably seemed fairly dull to him by this time with the sorts of interests and backgrounds and degrees that he had. So he started to kind of flex his writing muscles. He decided to try his hand at writing some science fiction short stories. And he got into a discussion with some friends of his one time about how he got his ideas. And they wondered if he did like many writers they heard that would just kind of come up with a few characters and attributes and then sit down to write and just let the characters tell the story themselves, and that's how it would develop in the author's mind. And Bester thought that was ridiculous. That was kind of born from the idea of a play that was written by Italian playwright Luigi Pirandello. he had a 1921 play called Six Characters in Search of an Author. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's an opera, and it's kind of a play within a play. It's the story of a director who is holding rehearsals for a production that is about to open. And in wander these six very strange people. They announce that they are characters that are unfinished, and they have no story. They're undeveloped characters by a failed playwright, and they are demanding that their stories be fleshed out. So the director is kind of befuddled by this, but he lets them start talking amongst themselves. And as they do so, their stories actually come out. They have started with kind of a character description, but there's no story involved. And as they start interacting, dramas and stories between them start to emerge. And by the end of this, they have a pretty well-established story and conflicts and relationships between each other that winds up becoming the story of the play. So as Bester's friends were talking to him about that idea, Bester just thought that was a ridiculous way to write a story. So they wanted to know, well, then what do you do? Now, Bester was pretty new at writing stories. He was just trying to learn how to do it and just kind of having fun with this new interest. But he'd stuck his neck out and said that he didn't write that way. So he had to come up with something. So he just kind of on the fly, he said, well, I come up with a character that has some kind of a situation or maybe an ability, a strange ability, like walking through walls, for instance. And then I concoct a story that explains that in some logical way. So now he stuck his neck out and he feels like he has to deliver on that. It's kind of given him an idea for a story. So he writes this short story that he called Zeoh-X. And he sent it into Thrilling Wonder Stories. And unfortunately, it got rejected. But the editors there, Mort Weisinger and Jack Schiff, who later went on to work for Superman DC Comics a few years later, they liked Bester. So they got talking with him, and they really enjoyed him, all his analyses and things of James Joyce. And so they just liked the guy, and they thought that, this story that you submitted is not up to snuff as far as publishing as it is. But if you can rework it and polish it up, and here's maybe some ideas of how you can do that. We are having the first contest, kind of an amateur writers contest that we're going to start in an upcoming issue here. And why don't you polish this story up and submit it for that story? We're looking for new blood and new writers, and this might just be the candidate. So he did that, and he won. They changed the title to The Broken Axiom, and it appeared in that April 1939 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories. Now, having just read The Broken Axiom with that original title, Zeoh-X, in mind, I have no idea what that might have meant. There seems to be no reference or mention of it in the story, at least as it was published. It could be that it just got written out when Bester went to repolish the story for the contest. He did say in later years that he always felt that Zeoh-X was a ridiculous title, so he might have just changed it. But it could also be that in that very same April 1939 issue, Ray Cummings had a story titled Zeoh-X. And it could just be that they felt that that was one too many fill-in-the-blank X titles for one issue. I don't know that one way or the other, but just looking at the table of contents for that issue makes me speculate. Could be nothing more than coincidence, but it doesn't really matter. But to get back to that contest, that is also the very same amateur writing contest that Robert Heinlein heard about that prompted him to write his very first science fiction short story, Lifeline. And I did a video about that a while ago also. I'll leave a link to it down below if you're interested in that. But just so you know, the fact that Heinlein got his story published in Astounding science fiction for $20 more than the $50 prize that Bester won for that Thrilling Wonder story contest. Became a bit of an amicable point of contention between the two in later years. Now, let's get back to the Broken Axiom, the story, Alfred Bester's Thrilling Wonder debut. And if you've read it, you may wonder what's so thrilling about it. It has never been reprinted in any collection or anthology, at least not that I know of. And Alfred Bester himself thought that it was a bad story. In fact, he didn't like any of his early stories, predating his going over to write for DC Comics with Mort Weisinger. But be that as it may, I'm here to defend the story. I quite enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun, and I think it's because I try to put myself back in the time that the story was written, and with the expectations that the story itself hoped to gain. As I say, this was on the eve of the golden age of science fiction. Science fiction has not yet taken the absolute turn that science fiction could be written more seriously. So it was just a fun story that involved what I've always liked to call comic book physics. And those are the physics that you often see in the early golden age and silver age of comic books, in particular DC Comics, where the physics make sense within the fantasy of the story, of that world, but don't really hold up to much scrutiny as far as actual science goes. Just to create a fun story with some suggestion that there is some scientific principle, at least at the root of it, so that it isn't just pure fantasy. That's a long-winded way of saying that the Broken Axiom holds up under those conditions, I think. And I enjoyed some aspects of it. Like early on in the story, it's the story of Dr. Halliday and his lab assistant, Graham. And Halliday has just developed a matter transmitter in his lab. And early on, Graham is looking at it and thinking how simple the contraption is that does this amazing thing. And Halliday explains that in most cases, these great fantastic inventions that we were seeing more and more of in the early 20th century were really simple in principle. The complexity was in the development and the intellectual conception of whatever the project was. But once it came down to actually a working apparatus, it was usually pretty simple in principle. And that kind of rings true to me, I feel, like when I think of all kinds of inventions and things, that once you understand what is really going on behind the scenes, the machine itself is usually as basic as possible. So there was that aspect to it. Now, this matter transmitter, he's rigged up. He's already tested it with rats and mice and dogs and things. And now he wants to try it on a human being. And of course, being 1939, that's going to be himself. So he's going to test it on himself. He's not getting any permission from anybody. Or this is just the way the world was back then in his reality. So he has to have, because he's putting himself through the device now, he needs Graham to operate the machine for him. So he gives him kind of a quick review of how to do that. And this goes on, well, I shouldn't say quick, it goes on for many pages. A lot of the science fiction of the day was a great deal explaining the science behind the story. And that was what was the hook in those days, especially coming out of Hugo Gernsback's philosophy. You're trying to get people interested in science, and then the story was just a vehicle, really, to make it exciting and fun to learn about what science might be capable of. And that's kind of where this story starts from. But what happens then, of course, is that Halliday goes through the transmitter, and when he is coming to consciousness, having been transported across the lab to the second table there, he has a hard time getting his bearings. He can't see very well. Everything is very dark. And when he tries to stand up off the table, he kind of slumps through it. He's finding that he can't get a purchase on anything. He's just reassembled improperly. and is actually sinking slowly through the flooring of the lab and is struggling to get out of it. And he manages to do that, and he's kind of starting to panic. He can't hear his assistant talking to him. He doesn't feel like he can be heard trying to explain to the assistant what he needs to do or what's going on. So he kind of panics, and he runs out through the wall and outdoors. And this is where that germ of the idea that Bester was talking to his friends about, a man who is able to walk through walls, is the origin of the story, I guess you might say. Anyway, as he runs out through into the outdoor area, he finds himself running across Hamilton Walk and Woodland Avenue. Well, little specifics like that always perk me up when I'm reading a story, so I had to Google it. And it turns out that Hamilton Walk and Woodland Avenue are just right outside the University of Pennsylvania, where Alfred Bester got his 3 or 4 degrees. So he's writing about a place he's well familiar with. So of course he's working in landmarks and things. And so that's interesting. So that's in Philadelphia. And if you're familiar with Philadelphia at all, then you'll also recognize the intersection of 34th Street and Chestnut. Chestnut being the street that leads up to Independence Hall, where the Liberty Bell is. Anyway, doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter to the story. It's just that now we understand that this professor, this doctor of science, is a doctor in the science department at the University of Pennsylvania. Just little things like that make it more enjoyable for a guy like me anyway. But doesn't matter to the story. Once he finds himself running through the streets and is looking around at what's going on, and like I say, it's dark and kind of fuzzy to him, he starts to see these big red cloud blobs kind of floating around and converging around him. And he starts to realize that these are living creatures. And he is somehow in between 2 dimensions, maybe. And he's found himself there because the machine wasn't set properly when he transmitted to the other table. And instead, he's reassembled out of frequency with his own world and the reality that these red clouds live in. They seem to be intelligent, or at least curious creatures, and they're starting to surround him. And then there's some other black cloud that seems to be intruding into this thing and seems to be a true menace. So he's panicking and now trying to get back into his lab, where maybe he can somehow communicate with Graham and get himself reassembled somehow. He's likened it to being out of frequency, I say, like between 2 radio stations, and where you can kind of hear one station fuzzy and another station fuzzy. Neither of them are really clear, and that's what he's experiencing of the reality of these 2 dimensions. He's somewhere in between. I should mention here that the title, The Broken Axiom, is referring to the axiom that no 2 bodies can occupy the same space at the same time. And that's why he's, the explanation of the story is that that's what he is apparently doing. He's slipping through the physicality of his own world. But really, if you think about it, it's not quite that. It's that he's occupying 2 places at the same time. He's in between, or what am I trying to say? You know what I'm trying to say. He's not occupying the same space at the same time. He's occupying 2 spaces at the same time, but he's just not cohesive in either one. Anyway, that's the gist of the story, and then it resolves in an interesting way, and I'll let you read the story if you're interested in it. But because this is Scotty Phillips's channel, and he likes to talk about artwork, there was one illustration that appeared with this story when it was first published. Now, as I say, the story itself has not apparently been deemed worth reprinting anywhere. So as far as I know, there are no other pieces of artwork for The Broken Axiom. But let's take a look at the one that did actually appear with the first printing of this story. Here we have the opening spread of The Broken Axiom, and on the first page here we see a little call out introducing the author of their very first prize-winning story, Alfred Bester. And if you want to pause the screen, hopefully it's clear enough that you can read that if you want to. But if you don't, it discusses his various interests, Bester's various interests and degrees, having gone to the University of Pennsylvania and that kind of thing. A short little bio. First time he's appeared in print. And then as we pan over to the right side of the spread, we see the illustration here, the one and only illustration for The Broken Axiom by Frank R. Paul. Now, I discussed a little bit more of Frank R. Paul in yet another video I'll leave a link to below if you're interested. But that was the debut story of Clifford D. Simak, World of the Red Sun. But here in this particular Paul illustration, we see Dr. Halday's lab, and in the background, we see his assistant Graham watching the ethereal form of Dr. Halday after he's been transmitted across the lab as he's sinking into the floor, and we can see a concerned look on Halday's face there. He's trying to figure out what's going on. And then we can also see the apparatus itself is pretty much as described in the story for a few pages, but very simple. He's got up at the top, he's got some Coolidge tubes connected with a pipe between the two different operating tables. You've got to lie on a table here. It's not like a transporter booth for this particular matter transmitter. But that's the problem he's having now, is he's sinking through the floor. And it's a nice literal interpretation of things that are described in the story. And I like the drawing quite a bit. Just the fact that it's a tall vertical illustration rather than the more typical horizontal drawings that you would more often see. And I don't think that Frank R. Paul knew exactly where his illustration would appear in the story. But the fact that it was positioned over on the right side of the opening spread makes a nice eye flow, I feel like. From the beginning of the story, you read across it, and then you're drawn into the story, having read already the description that we're seeing in the drawing, and then down, and it just finishes off that spread in a nice eye flow manner. Very nice. I've always felt that Frank R. Paul's interior illustrations are much better than his cover paintings, which he's mostly known for. Just feel like his cover paintings are often just look a little amateurish and are pretty garish in color, typical of the printing system in those days, what they felt sold magazines. But I've just always much preferred his interior black and white pen and ink illustrations. So deal with that. Now, let's move on to, let's cross the border into the golden age of science fiction, and we're leaving the eve of the golden age of science fiction behind us now, going into December, the end of that first year of the golden age, with Alfred Bester's second story, No Help Wanted, which appeared in the December 1939 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories. Now, there's no artwork to talk about with this particular story. In fact, it only occupied a single page in the back of that issue. And under the byline, here's a little point of interest here, by Alfred Bester, it says, author of The Broken Axiom, etc. Now, what does that etc. mean? I think they're kind of stretching it there. He's only had one published story so far. So it probably should have just said author of The Broken Axiom and leave it at that. Maybe they were trying to insinuate that, yes, he has written more stories. He's not just a one-off guy, and maybe they're hoping to publish more Bester stories in the future, perhaps. But I kind of feel it's unnecessary. But the story itself is actually pretty clever, I think, as short as it is. It's got a neat little twist ending, and it reminds me for all the world of those one-page text-only stories that you used to be able to find lurking in the pages of old Silver Age comic books, those stories that no one would ever read. But it might actually have been a kind of a foreshadowing for Alfred Bester going on a few years down the line from these stories to when he was writing for DC Comics. But getting back to the actual story, being written in late 1939, we were coming out of the Great Depression in those days, and people reading the story back then would have been very familiar with breadlines and how difficult it was to have a really decent job and that kind of thing. And so this is a story told in the first person by someone who is trying to avoid falling back on the breadlines and getting a decent job. And he's walking past York University, which is a fictional university in this particular case. It doesn't matter where it is. You kind of get the idea that it's in New York by the name, but doesn't matter. The point is that he's walking past York University's observatory, and it occurs to him that with his experience as an astrophysicist, that he is qualified for any kind of a job that they might have. So he goes in to apply for such a job, and then it's the story of how they talk to him and interview him and try to get to the bottom of his background and why he is qualified, leading up to the punchline of the story there. Now, one thing I didn't mention in the Broken Axiom that kind of is reflected in this too is Dr. Barton. Now, Dr. Barton is a character in the Broken Axiom that Dr. Halliday runs past when he's kind of phased between those two dimensions, and he's running back into the campus, and he runs past and through Professor Barton teaching one of his classes, and he's just kind of a throwaway character, and he's gone. And then in No Help Wanted, Dr. Barton appears again in this story. Don't think it's supposed to be the same character, but the name is connected with the university again. And I just wonder if Bester himself had Professor Barton or Dr. Barton when he was going to the University of Pennsylvania. Don't know, but it's just a name he fell back on 2 stories in a row there early on. It's another just one of my speculations, but you're learning to deal with that anyway. So there you have it. And there you have it for the initial debuts of Alfred Bester, his very first story before the Golden Age, and his very next story just after the beginning of the Golden Age, taking that line in the sand with a grain of salt. But anyway, if you are an Alfred Bester fan, let me know in the comments below. And I should also say that if you're interested in either of these 2 stories, they have not been reprinted anywhere else as far as I know, as well as many other of Bester's early stories from those days. But they are available online in PDF form. So if you're interested, I will leave a link to those down below, and you can go and check them out. They're both very short reads. But as I say, leave any comments if you're a Bester fan. Have you read any of these early stories? Are you a fan of his later work? Anything in particular? You're familiar with any of his comic book stories that he may have written? Let's chat about that. So I've really been enjoying going back and doing these early science fiction stories, so I'll probably continue with doing more of those. Hopefully you will like them as well. Always love talking about the illustrations. I don't think they get the attention they really deserve. They're hardly ever reprinted. Many stories from those days are reprinted, sometimes very often. Hardly ever do the illustrations get to tag along for that ride, and I think that's a shame. So if you like discussion and that kind of thing, hopefully you'll come back for more. So until you do come back for more, and until we can chat again, thanks a lot.